From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, and this is a podcast about South Carolina culture and history, with a nod to all things Southern. I'll be joined today by my producer and co-host, Alfred Turner.
And our guest today is Peter Cozzens, an international award-winning author and editor of 18 books on the American Civil War and the American West.
In his latest book, A Brutal Reckoning, Andrew Jackson, the Creek Indians, and the Epic War for the American South, Peter Cozzens vividly captures the young Andrew Jackson, describing a brilliant but harsh military commander with unbridled ambition, a taste for cruelty, and a fraught sense of honor and duty. Jackson would not have won the Creek War without the help of Native American allies, yet he denied their role and even insisted on their displacement, together with all of the Indians of the American South in the Trail of Tears. With me on the line today is Peter Cozzens, and we're talking to him from his home in Kensington, Maryland, and we'll be talking primarily about his latest book, the latest of 18 books that he's written or edited, entitled A Brutal Reckoning, Andrew Jackson, the Creek Indians, and the Epic War for the American South. So with that introduction, Peter, welcome to the Journal.
Thank you so much for hosting me.
And before we get into the book, I'd just like to talk about your career a little bit. I find your career interesting. Peter's a graduate of Knox College in Illinois, and then he went in the Army. He had an ROTC scholarship and a 4-year obligation. And after that, he went into the Foreign Service. And Peter, how about recapping a little bit of your Foreign Service experience? You seem to be in every hot spot in Latin America.
I spent 20 of my 30-year career overseas in Latin America, in Peru during the days of Shining Path terrorism, in Panama when we turned the canal over to the Panamanians, in Costa Rica, 2 tours in Mexico, Honduras desk officer during the Contra era, which really dates me, I guess. But like most FSOs, I devoted myself principally to one region of the world and don't regret it at all.
Okay.
And Peter, you have a guest I hear in the background.
Oh my gosh, you can hear him all the way from downstairs. Yeah, that's my my loud but friendly Labrador Retriever.
Which is quite fine. I just wanted to make note of it.
Okay. And when you retired, you decided to devote yourself full-time to writing, although you had been writing primarily about the Civil War while you were still in the Foreign Service, right?
That's correct. I sort of had 2 careers in tandem, but after my first book was published when I was 32, I recognized that my true vocation was writing, and so I retired the instant I was eligible, and turned to writing full time, and have not regretted it one moment.
All right, you moved from the Civil War to writing about Native Americans, and this book is really the third of a trilogy that you have written about the new United States and its westward expansion and the impact that had on Native American peoples, the Midwest, the Far West, and now the Deep South. What made you turn from the Civil War to Native Americans?
Well, initially I thought in terms of just a standalone book on the Indian Wars of the American West, those, of course, being the conflicts that popular culture and most associates with our expansion as a nation. I wrote that because I felt that, 40 years had passed since D. Brown wrote Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and I thought there was a real need for a more balanced account of what occurred in the West. And so I wrote The Earth is Weeping, which I believe succeeded in its objective. It's been translated into a number of languages, including Russian and Chinese. And once I finished that book, I realized that there was so much more to the story, that the really critical conflicts between the young American Republic and American Indians occurred east of the Mississippi, and really their resolution made the conquest of the tribes in the West pretty much a fait accompli.
Let's turn to the South and set the background. The first European impact was De Soto, of course, in the 16th century, and he did two things. One was the great confrontation in what's now Alabama, the Battle of Mobile, or Movilla, depending upon how you spell it, and, of course, the disease that he brought. But you make a number of comparisons between De Soto and his dealings with the Native Americans and Andrew Jackson in terms of personality.
Right. What struck me in terms of their similarities was just how single-minded they were in achieving their objectives. In De Soto's case, it was his rather quixotic quest for gold and riches in the American South, and a concomitant brutal treatment of any native inhabitants that stood in the way of his objectives. And in Jackson's case, it was his relentless, single-minded perseverance in prosecuting the war against the Red Sticks, as the hostile Creek Indians were called, to its conclusion, even after everyone else from the administration of President James Madison, which was busy fighting the British in the War of 1812, to the governor of his own state of Tennessee, wanted to kind of give things up and concede the game to the Creeks. He pursued his course with a single-mindedness that is, if not unique in American history, certainly there are very few, if any, characters who so influenced such a critical chapter in our history as did Andrew Jackson in achieving victory in the Creek War, which led then to the displacement of the Indians from the American South, west Mississippi, and the Trail of Tears. And if it hadn't been for Jackson's single-minded determination to prosecute this war to conclusion, the Deep South might never have come about as we know it, or certainly not for a number of generations.
All right, well, let's talk about who were the Creeks. Explain that to our listeners.
Sure. The book begins, as you mentioned, with De Soto's march through the Deep South in the mid-1600s, and I spent a good deal of time on the development of the Creek people and their culture and their interactions with the British and French and Spaniards and ultimately the Americans after the Revolution. But the bulk of the narrative and the real action begins at the turn of the 19th century, just preceding the War of 1812. And at that time, the American South, as we know it, did not exist. The Creek Indians were a loose confederation of largely autonomous villages that claimed as their domain all of modern Alabama, as well as the western half and the southern portion of Georgia. So they controlled a huge swath of what is today the Deep South. And the other three major tribes in the South were the Cherokee, who controlled a good portion of northern Georgia, as well as southeastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. And then there were the Chickasaw and Choctaw Indians, who pretty much split the northern two-thirds of Mississippi between them. So the Deep South, as we know it, was largely in native hands at the turn of the 19th century. And the Creeks, numbering about 25,000, were the dominant people among those four Indian nations in terms of both the amount of land they claimed and their numbers.
The Creeks, although there were, as you mentioned, they were autonomous villages, some of the Creeks had begun to westernize. They had begun to intermarry with Europeans, creating a half-caste, a mestizo, and there were those who were talking about tribal purity. So there is a Creek War with Andrew Jackson, but before that, there's a civil war within the Creek Nation, is there not?
That's right. The Creeks, who were known as the Muskogees, and that's what they called themselves then, based on the shared Muskogean language. But they were known to the British and the Americans as Creeks because the first British traders who met them found them residing on creeks or rivers and began calling them Creeks. But the Creek people divided into what were known as the Upper Creek and the Lower Creek, and that depended on their location with respect to the principal trading route into the Creek country. Those living to the north and west were the Upper Creeks. Those to the south and east were the Lower Creeks. And it was the Lower Creeks, in a nutshell, who living closer to whites, living closer to Georgia's settlers and to traders and more prone to intermarriage, they began to assimilate some aspects of white culture, agriculture, things of that nature, while the Upper Creeks, being farther removed from the whites and more suspicious of American intentions at encroaching on their land, maintained traditional values. The tensions between the Upper and Lower Creeks burst into a civil war in 1812, almost concurrent with the outbreak of the War of 1812. And the Upper Creeks, who fomented the Civil War, called themselves the Red Sticks after the traditional red clubs they carried. And they were led by prophets who believed that they could return all of the Creek Confederacy to a pure, more traditional Creek way of life, impervious to American influence.
So in essence, this was a 19th century cultural war.
Exactly. It was the started as the most brutal internecine war within one Indian nation. All Indian tribes and nations tended to split throughout history between those who sought accommodation with the Western American Republic and those who advocated resistance. But nowhere was it more profoundly violent than in the Creek Nation.
Weren't a number of the leading figures among the Lower Creeks mixed caste?
Not only among the Lower Creeks, but among the Red Sticks as well. You had, for instance, the principal prophet of the Red Sticks was a fellow named Josiah Francis. Their principal military leaders were Paddy Walsh and William Weatherford. I mean, these are hardly typical Indian names. And that came about, again, because of this intermarriage of first British, and then during the Revolution, Tories, who intermarried with Creek women from prominent clans, and this was a matrilineal society. So if you were a male born of a Creek woman and a white man, you took on the surname of your father, but you found your place in Creek society based on your mother's ties. And the mixed race element of the Creek, both the Upper and Lower Creeks, by the early 19th century had achieved dominance over Creek political life.
So, Peter, you're talking about this conflict between these two groups with opposing views among the Creeks as being particularly explosive, particularly big and violent, as opposed to things that had happened, divisions that had happened amongst other Indian tribes and nations. Is there any way to account for why this one was particularly big and bad?
I think it was the influence of the prophets among the Red Sticks who argued that if not physically extirpate, they had to bring the Lower Creeks completely to heel in order to achieve their objective of cleansing Creek society and returning it again to a more pure form. Whereas with most other tribes, there was a tendency for elements of tribes to kind of go their own way, but peaceably between factions with respect to either accommodation or resisting the whites. It seldom led to conflict between the factions themselves.
So prophets, I want to understand that word in the context that the Creeks might have understood it in the time. We think 21st century, we look back on 2,000 years of Christianity, more of Judaism, et cetera, But these were people who had a religious power, or did they have political power too?
It was the religious power, but among the Indians, particularly those living east of the Mississippi River, there was a real strong tradition of belief in prophets, that is to say, individuals who were held to have direct connection with the master of life, with God, and who exercise influence through this divine connection that people recognize. And they really exercised as much authority and influence in many cases, as did political and military leaders, and they could steer the course of an Indian society. So there was this deep tradition in the tribes, both in the South and the modern Midwest, of yielding to the dictates of recognized prophets.
And this Creek Civil War in 1812 soon involved the western frontier in Alabama, southern Alabama. European settlement had been there for a long time, but Fort Mims, which was in present-day southeastern Alabama, was a strong point, and the attack on Fort Mims, the massacre at Fort Mims, is what brought Andrew Jackson into the conflict.
What happened in a nutshell was what's called the Tensaw region, a district about 50 miles north of Mobile, had become settled by mixed race, Métis Creeks, who didn't want to be part of the Creek Confederacy anymore. They wanted to go their own way and become small plantation owners, and they welcomed whites into their midst. And say you had this pocket on the western edge of the Upper Creek country of kind of recalcitrant people who still, by virtue of the matrilineal society, were Creek, and the Upper Creeks believed them to be subject to their jurisdiction, who were welcoming whites into their midst and rejecting the Upper Creeks and subsequently rejecting the Red Sticks. And they became a thorn in the side of the Red Sticks, and the Red Sticks made their first move to eliminate that pocket of resistance in their midst. And the strongest point was Fort Mims, which was one of a number of hastily built stockades that held both Mississippi Territorial Militia and men, women, and children of mixed race and white heritage, as well as their black slaves. And that the Red Sticks attacked Fort Mims on August 30th, 1813, perpetrated the worst massacre of women and children by Native Americans in U.S. history. And that sparked a larger war with the United States and caused the state of Tennessee and Georgia and what was then the Mississippi Territory to fear for their very existence, fear that the Red Sticks intended to take the war to them as well, which the Red Sticks boasted of doing. And that's how the war became a conflict between the Red Sticks and the United States. The administration of James Madison, as important as this was, the future of the Deep South was at stake here. They were so preoccupied with fighting the British in Canada and New York and heck on Chesapeake Bay itself near Washington, that they didn't pay a lot of attention to the conflict, and it was fought by the territorial state militia and volunteers.
Well, having grown up on the Gulf Coast, Fort Mims was part of our local history, and the defense at Fort Mims was pretty slack. The gates had been left open for a long time, and sand had washed up against the gates. So when the Indians attacked, they couldn't close the gates to the fort.
And the Fort Mims had a commander who was an alcoholic who didn't really give a damn much what happened, and actually had sort of almost suicidal tendencies. He was a depressive sort and really didn't much care, and the garrison paid the price.
You describe what happened. Probably 250 to 300 people in the fort were killed, and as you mentioned, it was not just whites. In fact, the settlement Creeks, so to speak, was the largest group of folks that were killed, and also enslaved persons. So that's what, as you mentioned, that's what brought Andrew Jackson into the picture. Why don't you take up the story there? Because before his great victory at Horseshoe Bend, he had mixed results in waging war in Alabama and Florida, what we would now call Alabama and Florida.
Well, when the Creek War began, it was pretty much left to the Mississippi Territory, Georgia, and Tennessee to conduct the conflict. And because the Mississippi, Georgia, and Tennessee all lay on the periphery of the Creek Confederacy, they couldn't communicate well among themselves. And they all went at it independently. There were two expeditions launched from Mississippi Territory between the fall of 1813 into the winter of 1814 that failed to permanently occupy any land in the Ristic country and ultimately withdrew. Two expeditions from Georgia that achieved limited success but were forced to withdraw also because of supply problems and short-term enlistments. And Andrew Jackson, at the time the war broke out, he was commander of the West Tennessee Militia, and he was given principal command of the Tennessee forces that invaded the Red Stick country from the north. And he launched two offensives in 1813, both of which achieved some victory on the battlefield. But again, he was unable to hold much more than just a supply depot on the northern fringes of the Red Stick country in Alabama. And by the beginning of 1814, the war had pretty much petered out. Mississippi Territory and Georgia were kind of willing to concede the game. Even the governor of Tennessee was suggesting that Jackson give it up and come home because it was evident that the Red Sticks did not really pose the threat to Tennessee's territorial integrity. Most of Jackson's men went home at the expiration of their enlistments. But Jackson, with a handful of followers, held on to their grip on the northern fringes of Alabama, of the Red Stick territory, until finally Jackson was reinforced in the early spring of 1814 with a large enough force and reliable enough supplies to make a really credible invasion of the Red Stick country, which he did in March with just over 3,000 men. And that led to the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which was the decisive battle in the Creek War and really brought the Red Sticks to heel and allowed the United States to achieve victory over the Red Sticks and eventually gain control of Alabama and western Georgia over the next 20 or so years and made the Trail of Tears inevitable.
Well, when Jackson started out, he was physically ill, was he not?
He was in bad shape. Jackson, when news of Fort Mims reached Nashville, Jackson was lying in bed in an inn in Nashville on death's doorstep. He had become involved in a ridiculous duel involving the younger brother of his principal subordinate in the militia, who was Thomas Hart Benton, the future Missouri senator. And Jackson and a couple of his friends and the Benton brothers got into a shooting match as a consequence of this duel. And Jackson was severely wounded in the shoulder, right shoulder and arm, and could barely get to his feet when he started off against the Creeks in 1813. He had to have help putting his coat on. He suffered from a suppurating wound, from chronic diarrhea. He was in terrible shape, but again, he had the strength of will and determination to take the field nevertheless.
So back to Horseshoe Bend for a second, because it's 1814, and he pretty much annihilated the stronghold of Red Stick people there, right? 800 or plus people.
Yeah, the Red Sticks. During the course of the conflict, they gradually broke into three major groups, each of which had an enclave to which they could retreat if necessary. Horseshoe Bend was a name given to a peninsula in the Tallapoosa River in central Alabama. And it was an enclave to about 1,000 Red Stick warriors and their families. And they were the only group of Red Sticks who had not really been bloodied at all when Andrew Jackson marched against them in March 1814. They were lodged behind a incredibly strong pine log barricade in this bend of the Tallapoosa River, pretty much impregnable barricade. Andrew Jackson decided to attack front on, while simultaneously sending his cavalry together with about 600 Cherokee allies downriver, across the river, take up positions on the far side of the Tallapoosa River, so that after he succeeded in breaching the barricade, any Red Sticks who tried to flee across the river would be cut down by the Cherokees and by his cavalry. That was Jackson's battle plan, at least for eliminating this final great Red Stick stronghold.
I have to say, hearing that he had 600 Cherokee as his allies, I find that dripping with irony, considering what happened later.
Absolutely. It was the Red Sticks' misfortune that the Creeks in general did not get along particularly well with their Cherokee, Chickasaw, or Choctaw neighbors. They had periodically waged war against these tribes, and these three other tribes really thought it in their best interest to take the side of the United States when the Creek War broke out. So the Red Sticks, pretty much the 4,500 or so Red Stick warriors, despite the fact that they controlled most of Alabama, they pretty much had to go alone against the combined forces of the states of Georgia and Tennessee and Mississippi Territory, as well as their Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Lower Creek allies. So it was ironic. It was indeed.
And when we talk about the Red Stick defensive position, it was a log fort, and Andrew Jackson at first thought he had two small cannon. One was a 2-pounder, which is like a BB gun, but I mean, he had a larger one, but the shot just bounced off. But
it wasn't a fort. Rather, it was a line of breastworks, a long palisade that stretched across the mouth of this peninsula on the Tallapoosa River, behind which there were again 1,000 Red Stick warriors, and then further back on the banks of the Tallapoosa was their village in which the women and children resided. And Jackson, believed that his artillery would be sufficient to breach that barricade. Unfortunately, it wasn't. His cannon fired away for a couple hours without making scarcely a dent in the palisade. And this is a grand irony in that his victory at Horseshoe Bend, his defeat of the Red Sticks, was due not so much to his generalship as to the initiative of a few Cherokee warriors who decided on their own to swim across the Tallapoosa, grab some Red Stick canoes that were on the bank by their village, and row back across and seize the Red Stick village of Tohopica, it was called. And it was the Cherokee seizure of the village that caused a lot of the Red Stick warriors to abandon the barricade and fall back to defend their families, and that so weakened the strength of the palisade that Jackson was able to launch a frontal attack and successfully reach the barricade and defeat the Red Sticks. It had not been for the the Cherokees taking the initiative in crossing the river and taking the village, Jackson, I think, would have been defeated at Horseshoe Bend and forced to retreat.
And what happened there, it was a battle, but it turned into a massacre as the Red Sticks were fleeing. Those who jumped into the river trying to swim to the other side were picked off. But the count of the Red Sticks killed was 577. This is part of the story too, and that violence was not always one way, red to white.
No,
it by no means at all. White settlers and volunteers and militiamen were guilty of atrocities just as great, if not greater, than those perpetrated by Native Americans. And Native Americans, again, fought defensively to protect their lands. They did not initiate wars of conquest by any means. Horseshoe Bend just stands out. It was, in a number of ways, it effectively brought an end to the Creek War. It represented the largest loss of life of Indian warriors in any battle during the 100 years of conflict between the Western American Republic and native inhabitants of the United States. It also was the battle that brought Andrew Jackson to national prominence. It was Horseshoe Bend and not the Battle of New Orleans that made Jackson a household name. Because of his victory at Horseshoe Bend, he was given a major generalship in the regular army, and command of the military department that took on the British when they did finally invade the Gulf Coast region, and that culminated in the Battle of New Orleans. And so the victory at Horseshoe Bend set in motion two things: Andrew Jackson's march to the White House, and ultimately the dispossession of Indian lands, because after Horseshoe Bend, the Red Sticks were unable to mount effective resistance any further, and there was no other Indian people in the South able to resist the Americans. And again, there was a slow but inexorable usurpation of Indian lands in the South, and which ultimately led to the growth of the Cotton Kingdom in the Deep South, and that which in turn led to the American Civil War. So it was an extraordinarily crucial moment in our early history.
It absolutely was, and not all of the Creeks were dispossessed. There's still a small group in Alabama in Conecuh County that managed to hide out, and they are a federally recognized tribe still. Peter, Alfred's giving me the wind-up sign, which I don't always like. I sometimes fuss at him because there are a lot of things I would like to cover. As a historian and also as a native Mobilian, your characterization of the importance of the Creek War is something that people really need to take into account. And
it was. I consider it, after having written these three books, I consider it to be the most significant conflict between American Indians and the United States. In the 100 years of conflict between the end of the Revolution and the closing of the frontier. I mean, it was the most consequential. Okay. It created the Deep South and created the conditions for slavery to be rejuvenated in the South, which in turn led to the American Civil War. So it was a critical conflict. And without, again, if Jackson had not been so determined to prosecute this war to conclusion, with the British coming into the Gulf Coast region in the latter part of 1814, had the Red Sticks, I should say, been allowed to maintain their ground, the whole course of the Southern history would have been changed. The British would have united with the Red Sticks, and who knows what would have happened. And where Alabama and Western Georgia, Mississippi, and for that matter, Florida, which was then a Spanish possession and only existed because of the Creek barrier to the Americans, where things would have stood had Jackson not, insisted on seeing this war through.
Well, it's an epic story, and Peter Cozzens, the author of A Brutal Reckoning, Andrew Jackson, the Creek Indians, and the Epic War for the American South. I want to thank you so much for being with us today on The Journal. I hope you enjoyed today's journal. I think that you'll agree after listening to our conversation with Peter Cozzens that the Creek War is one of the most tragic episodes in American history. It led to the greatest loss of Native American life on what is now U.S. soil, and what began as a vicious internal conflict among the Creek Indians metastasized like a cancer. The ensuing Creek War of 1813 to 1814 shattered Native American control of the Deep South and led to the infamous Trail of Tears, in which the government forcibly removed the southeastern Indians from their homeland. The Creek War had a close relationship with the history of South Carolina.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment. Views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
New episodes of our podcast are published on the first and third Fridays of the month and are available at southcarolinapublicradio.org, as well as on the SCETV app, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google, Amazon, and Pandora.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio.
We'll talk again soon.